So, Beardiest, the last
Yes.
episode, we got a lot of basic questions of Warhammer 40K out of the way, into its origins a little bit. I think we touched upon a couple cool points that I want to expand upon a little bit. You said that one of the things that really drew you to the franchise and really distinguished the franchise is its darkness, its depressive quality. What would you say some of the inspirations for this are? Because I'll say the first thing that popped into my head when in the last episode is Vietnam War. That this is a fantasy setting inspired by a Vietnam War, a disillusioned generation. But you also said it's a company based in England, so I don't know if they were as disillusioned by the Vietnam conflict as we were, or if that was... Anyway, you're the expert. Fill me in on this, Matt. Expand a little bit for me.
Well, regarding the Vietnam War, I think that would have more to do with the 40K setting, and we can touch on that in a little bit. Now, regarding fantasy, I think it just harkens to just the very nature of the Renaissance era warfare. Before then, and this is ground in history. Little known fact: I do have a degree in history, and I kind of learned about a little bit of this this early modern era, this military revolution, if you will. So back in the Middle Ages, there weren't that many casualties. One, you didn't have these large standing armies. You'd have an individual noble who would have his men at arms and kind of hold up in his castle, who would roll out. And they weren't a standing army like we think of them now. They were more like gangsters. They would roll out, shake the locals down, make sure nobody was hiding anything, maybe steal off with an innkeep's daughter, and that was that. If there were any pitched battles, they would try and capture the leaders or any sort of noble, because he was worth much more alive than he was dead, because then his daddy or his mommy would pay handsomely to have him back. So with the advent of muskets, pike and shot, this changed the era tremendously, because before, only the nobles had enough time on their hands and a sufficient diet to train in martial matters. Now, with the advent of a musket, and you can just put a bayonet on it, or have a guy with a pike standing by to guard you while you're reloading. Now the peasants can get involved, and now you have a mass of bodies, and they're not so discriminate about who they kill. They have however many guys wide, however many deep, just firing shot at the oncoming army. And, they're not really going to be, discriminate about who they kill. I think it was, I don't want to say Battle of Agincourt, but there was, I think maybe it was Battle of Cressy, I think I learned about in Professor DeBrule's class. Way back when in my college days, and it was just like the flower of, it was either French or British nobility it was just gutted. They were just wiped out. So then, you get rid of this. Of course, then still, the nobles.
It was the curtain call for that romantic appeal of martial warfare.
Yeah. Yeah, you don't. Of course, you can still probably find videos, movies, and which glamorizes the officer leading the valiant charge across no man's land.
Charge of the Light Brigade, right?
Yeah, the charge of the Light Brigade, Pickett's last charge, or Pickett's charge at the Battle of Gettysburg,
or that Glory movie with the little dude from Godzilla, Matthew Broderick.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm going out of control here.
No, it's still
you
true.
Make that comparison, Matt. our beardiest. Were you? Because a lot of fantasy literature, a lot of fantasy and science fiction in general, have stemmed from people who saw hard combat. As I'm sure you know, C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Narnia novels, and Tolkien, who is really a lot of people credit him as one of the wellspring, the font from which all this high fantasy, if you've ever looked at a fantasy book, it was largely inspired by Tolkien. And both of them served in World War I and were greatly affected by it. And I think you have over in Germany, the other side of World War I, you have the Grey Mauser, who's another pioneering fantasy tale, and Ernst Junger, who made Storm of Steel was his World War I diary, but he also had a fantasy tale about the ranger in the woods, and the noble ranger was... Anyway, I digress. I don't want to bring my personal life into this. But, so we see how there's a connection, clearly, between classic fantasy novels, as we know them, as The Lord of the Rings, Narnia, and their ilk, everything they've inspired. Well, what do you think was the inspiration or the connection for Warhammer 40K? Well, Warhammer Fantasy.
You know, I think, honestly...
You know, any personal background in the creators or the writers of the fiction?
The only thing I know is about recent, and by recent, I mean, I think they had a fairly long stretch, and I've read a lot of online fans who engage in the tabletop setting and, you know, are very, I mean, you know, that's the thing about Warhammer fans that I've seen and I understand is, you know, they're hardcore. They really love their setting. I mean, if you really look at it, I mean, I don't want to disparage it because, I mean, I do love the setting, but there's not really much new to it. You know, I mean, everything you can find it's rooted in pre-existing, you know, settings like Tolkien and Lord of the Rings. Regarding the
do you know some
40K
of the roots
setting
of 40K of this Space Marine? We can sort of identify the roots of the original Warhammer Fantasy setting, but that it somehow went sour. It's sort of a reflection of modern warfare on the classical fantasy setting, right? But where are the roots of 40K, the science fictional setting?
I think it's, you know, there's a lot. There is, you know, the Starship Trooper, you know, genre. You know, they have, and I mean, it was before Halo, so I mean, you can't really say Halo and Master Chief are an inspiration. I have to say that they probably took some settings off that. But you know, you have your superhumans, you know, your Ubermensch, that you know, the Germans have talked about. You know, you have these, you know, you have your space locusts, which I think were in Starship Troopers. You know, they're also kind of likened to the aliens, and I've mentioned that in some of my playthroughs, the Gene Stealers, in which they essentially rape a subject and interject their genetic matter into them, only to create some monstrosity. But they also have a lot of fantasy. They have juxtaposed the fantasy setting into the sci-fi setting with their, you know, this idea of the warp, you know, this immaterium, this aether that allows for, it's kind of like a black hole, or that wormhole travel that's being postulated out there, that, you know, it's a lot quicker to go from point A to point B if you just fold the points on each other. But then you got to ask yourself what's in between there. Kind of like Event Horizon, where, you know, they go through, but it turns out that the ship goes through hell to travel. So, and they have demons and zombies and typical fantasy stuff in the setting as well.
But there's sort of at least a passing explanation to sort of ground some of these fantastical elements in hard science.
Sometimes, but I mean, there's there's a lot of talk of like demons bound to swords. I mean, I really do like the setting, but just because it's very flavorful. Mm-hmm. But if you want to look at it purely from a sci-fi perspective, you have to ask yourself, 40,000 years in the future, would we be using melee weapons? A lot of the sergeants and the officers carry these, swords and hammers.
It's funny you bring this up, because that was one of my questions, is how do you justify the giant, and I mean, from the perspective of a 13-year-old science fiction fan, there's probably nothing more badass than seeing this roided out monstrosity in mechanical armor with a chainsaw sword, right? But how do you justify, I know some novels have added some flourish to justify melee warfare, like Frank Herbert's Dune, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
Is there some sort of justification in the literature that you know of to defend that?
Not really, not that I've seen. I mean, really, it does, and you bring up an excellent point, and it's a big thing that fans of the setting are abhorrent about, is because it seems like Games Workshop panders to those 13-year-olds that you just mentioned. These Space Marines get a lot of attention. They are the fanboys, and I think they are the cash cow. And a lot of people who don't play or don't support the Space Marines, some of their armies are left behind. So, the codexes, these army books, they don't get the attention because they know in Games Workshop, and I mean, they're running a business ultimately. So, you got to figure they do have to make money at one point on one hand, but on the other, what are they doing for the rest of the fan base? And I mean, I really can't see it. I mean, in Star Wars, they have their lightsabers, but they play that away as, the only people who can use them are, people who are attuned to the Force and have supernatural abilities. But these melee weapons, and it's not just the Marines either. All armies have these melee troops that are that have these, like they have like pikes and axes and power fists, and you just can't help. And plus, you got even the sergeants; they're not wearing helmets. There's no real justification for that. I mean,
so there's not like a personal force shield or something of that nature to justify the diminishing of ranged combat.
Some of the characters, some of the higher ups, officers, unique characters, these special characters that are almost legendary. They do have some kind of force shields. What comes to mind is that the captains of the Space Marines have what's known as an iron halo, which grants what they call a ward save. And it's essentially like a power shield, Even the bullet can be straight on and it'll deflect it. But the ward saves are more of a tabletop thing. But you get the idea. It's an invuln shield that. It's a buff. It allows for, even though the person might be swinging dead true, might be shooting dead straight, and this person's still going to get through it.
And it harkens back, I guess, they're trying to maintain the motif of heavily armored knights, right?
Yeah, they are. They're the knights in shining armor, and before we get too involved in that setting, we only have about 10 seconds left, so we're going to have to cut it short here, but we can we can dig in more either way,
I'm
fantasy or.
excited. I think we're gonna